Good morning and welcome to our discussion on the future of European carbon removal policy organised by Carbon Gap, an NGO focusing on how carbon removals can work alongside emissions reductions to limit global temperature rise. Welcome to everyone in the room and welcome to those people joining us online. My name is Kira Taylor. I'm an energy and environment journalist based in Brussels. And I'll be moderating today's event as we look at current and future policies around carbon removals. So carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, as you're probably going to hear quite a lot today, is becoming increasingly important in the fight against climate change. On the European level, removals are increasingly seen in legislation and policy discussions, including the all-important 2030 target, which includes a target of how much carbon should be removed alongside emissions reductions. Individual European countries like Denmark, the UK and Switzerland are also making headway when it comes to carbon removals. For instance, Denmark's emissions reduction target would require at least 8 million tonnes of carbon dioxide to be removed from the atmosphere every year by 2050. But until now, there hasn't been a comprehensive picture of the regulatory framework that is there for carbon removals. Well, the team at Carbon Gap are looking to change that. They're a new environmental NGO focusing on eliminating the carbon dioxide already heating up our planet using ethical, responsible and effective carbon removals. Today, the NGO is launching its new policy tracker, an online tool that will give a picture of European legislation on carbon removals. I don't want to steal their thunder, so we'll hear more about that in a minute. After we've heard all about that policy tracker, we'll move on to a panel discussion to look at some of the policies it's actually tracking. We'll close our session with a final statement from the CEO of Carbon Gap, Glenn Morley. As part of our discussion today, you're invited to ask your questions both to the people who are in charge of the policy tracker and to our panellists. If you're in the room, it's very simple, just raise your hand. And if you're online, feel free to put your questions into the chat box on Zoom, and we will be able to ask them in the room. But first, to start our discussion and give us more information about the state of policy on carbon removals, I'd like to invite Eli Mitchell-Larsen, co-founder and Chief Science and Advocacy Officer at Carbon Gap, to the podium. Eli, to tell us more about all of this, you have the floor.
Thank you, Kira, and good morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. We're so pleased to have you here today, and what we're here to discuss is a policy tracker, which is live, tracker.carbongap.org. Even as you're watching, you can check out the tool live, but you'll hear all about that from the team that actually built it. So I just wanted to start with a few very simple points about the impetus behind this tool. Why did we build this? And really, the key piece is that carbon management and carbon removal touches every part of our society, right? If we're missing opportunities to absorb carbon into soils, forests, the built environment, we're missing out on opportunities for climate action. And of course, Europe hasn't been asleep in the climate policy department. There's decades of policies that have been built up to cover everything from soils to forests to offshore CO2 storage. And as a result, someone has to come in and start to make sense of where does CDR connect with that existing policy framework. We wanted to try to demystify how all of those policies work together, but also which policy pillars are actually missing. And we'll hear more about that in the panel. And it's always important to say that, for us, this tool is really meant to be a neutral tool. It's meant to provide information to anyone who wants to understand and engage with this topic. So, of course, we're framing this all as we're aiming for climate neutrality. Carbon removal is really just that last piece that gets us to the climate neutral and net negative thereafter goal. I also wanted to mention that we want to contextualize European policy in a global context. So although the policy tracker in its initial launch form is predominantly EU policy files with some country-level summaries, there's CDR policy emerging all around the world right now, and folks are watching Europe, right? And so there are opportunities for Europe to lead, including on certification, of course, and other themes. So as a result, we're hoping this tool becomes something that others can actually look to and stay up to date on what's happening in the EU and beyond. Sorry, advance one more slide, yeah. So we really wanted to highlight the partners that really helped us build this. So we couldn't have done this without the generous funding of Breakthrough Energy, as well as many partners who provided critical content to actually fill the tracker. The Net Zero Tracker team and the team at Oxford Net Zero that's affiliated with it, Carbon Future, Centrum Liberale Moderne, and Concito. As well, I wanted to highlight that we also interviewed upwards of 30, actually I think maybe even 40, policymakers, practitioners to actually build the tool. So the intent was, what do policymakers, what do civil society representatives need and want? Therefore, can we build a tool that meets that purpose? And then, although the entire team at Carbon Gap really rallied behind building this tool and the broader ecosystem that we engaged to design it, we wanted to highlight these 5 individuals particularly who are really responsible for breathing this into existence over the last 6 months. So congratulations to this team on launching the tool. Thank you. We want to actually hand over now to Davina, who will walk us through how the tracker works, what the tool looks like, how you can engage with it. But again, to Kira's point, please engage throughout the day, ask questions, and we'll have a link later where you can provide feedback on the tool itself. So thank you. Here's Davina.
Thank you. We'll start with a bit of a video demo on the policy tracker.
Welcome to the Carbon Gap Carbon Removal Policy Tracker. Through it, our ambition is to increase access to and awareness of European carbon removal policies. The Policy Tracker is divided into 4 main interfaces: the policy database, a map, the dashboard, and the resources section. The policy database shows all of the different policies, their jurisdictions and statuses. Clicking on any of these policies will give you more information about them. We have a brief summary about the policy, what changes are to come, and a more detailed examination of the policy. You can also find out more about what policymakers have said about these policies by looking at this section here. We also have a glossary of common abbreviations you can find here. We also present this data spatially in the form of a map, where you can learn about the policies implemented per country and can learn about what each country exactly is doing for CDR. Over here on the dashboard, you can explore different types of CDR and what policies are applied to each. For example, here I am exploring which policies are relevant for the funding of tax. And lastly, we have a page here with further resources you can explore about carbon dioxide removal. Feel free to navigate this tool on your own. We hope this tool gives you better understanding of the intricacies of CDR policies in Europe and inspires you to take action.
We've created a platform for everyone with an interest in CDR, whether it be a policymaker, a researcher, a non-profit organization, a business in the CDR space. We want to provide digestible insights on CDR policy and the process by which those policies are being shaped in the EU and across Europe, providing overviews of the emerging policy environment and painting a picture as well of how those different policies and programs interlink with one another and developing a holistic picture of the state of CDR policy. More than that, we want to demystify how actors in the CDR space can get involved. The heart of the idea is that by keeping up to date with what policies and areas that governments are looking into, not only can you be informed, but also you can be empowered to take action to point out the policy gaps that you think should be filled, to come together and respond to consultations, which the policy tracker will flag. So whether you're a policymaker in the parliament or a startup CDR company, we hope the tracker will empower you with the knowledge and the insights to take action. So there are 4 key sections to the policy tracker, or areas of the site. Firstly, we have the policy database, which gives an overview of EU policies and programs that are relevant to CDR, which I'll talk about in some further detail. We have our map view, which gives the regional overviews of different countries in Europe and what their ambitions for CDR are. We have the dashboard, which is where you get the chance to really play around with the information and the data in the tracker with custom filters and search terms so that you can really pull out the policies that are most relevant to your interests and keep up to date with those. And lastly, our resources page, which highlights other useful CDR tools and trackers, which we'll keep adding to in our bid to make sure that any and all information and resources that are helpful for the CDR ecosystem are being spread as wide as they can be. So in the policy database, we have overviews of CDR relevant policies, which are either adopted, under discussion, or proposed and hinted at through EU institutional documents. So at launch, we have 11 CDR policy files in there, and we'll be continuously adding more as the platform grows throughout this year and onwards. Some of these contain carbon gaps expert analysis for the key CDR policies that we are giving a deeper insight into. Clicking on each file takes you into our, in a nutshell, overview of what the policy does, what its key issues are, an overview of its status and what's currently being debated. And it highlights how the policy file relates to other interlinked CDR policies which are being developed or are in place in Europe. The tracker will update as legislative files evolve, moving from proposal to laws and to being implemented at national levels. And our timeline will show next steps for active files, and we list the relevant institutional stakeholders for those who are interested in who is shaping those policies and laws. So coming to our map view, the platform also assesses the degree to which CDR is being implemented and pursued in different countries around Europe, and the extent to which CDR policy is being considered in a country's wider net zero strategy. So we've provided in the tracker, thanks to many of our collaborative partners, a comprehensive sweep of net zero targets and CDR expansion and development plans in partnership with many of our collaborators on the tracker. We've taken a closer look at launch for 5 of the countries, which are Denmark, UK, Switzerland, Germany, and France. And we look forward to adding more and more of these countries in coming months. Each of the countries that we've looked at in detail cover the legal frameworks around CDR. They cover the R&D and innovation support that these countries have pledged towards CDR. And they also highlight not only the current state of play, but also highlighting what policy updates regional stakeholders should look out for on the horizon. So the dashboard is the most customizable section of the site. You can set search terms and filters to establish which policies are the most relevant for you. And you can receive alerts for the key policies that you're interested in as they either develop from proposal to legislation, or if you're interested in following the debates. We want to empower users with tailored insights on the policies that they need to be informed on and the policies that affect them. The dashboard creates visual overviews by adding rows and columns, selecting topics and files to see what's relevant. But more than that, you can see where the clear policy gaps are that are relevant to you and where additional EU action or regional action is needed. So overall, we're so excited to be sharing this platform with you, and hope that you'll share your experience and feedback with us as the tracker continues to grow.
Thank you, Davina and Ida. If I can invite you both to sit and we can maybe get into some questions about it. I'd say as a journalist who covers carbon removals, I am extremely excited about this because you've done half my work for me. So thank you for that. Maybe let's start with a quick question. You've mentioned that this is something you're going to be building. What new countries are you looking at? And what more do you expect to come in maybe the next year?
Sure. So the first few countries that we've looked at, we've tried to pick out either the biggest economies in Europe or the upcoming or current EU presidencies. So that'll be one approach by which we prioritize the next countries that we'll be adding. And we'll do that based on what would be useful to the ecosystem and where the action is essentially for CDR.
Excellent. And in putting this together, have you seen any major gaps which you think now need to be filled?
Yeah, so we often sort of divide the CDR policy suite into 5 pillars. We think about the innovation funding for the kind of early stage CDR methods. We talk about deployment incentives, which is really where you can start to scale a new climate solution. We discuss the kind of underpinnings, the regulatory underpinnings that ensure that removals are high quality. This is where the carbon removal certification framework comes in, transport and storage, and then the final piece, the sort of enduring policy regime, the possible future in which CDR is integrated into things like the border adjustment mechanism or the ETS. So, all 5 of those, of those pillars, certainly aren't covered. So there's significant gaps. And then I think we embrace what we think of as the sort of diverse regulatory culture of Europe. So every country, every member state is trying something different. For obvious reasons, Sweden has gone down a route of focusing on biomass and biogenic carbon capture. Switzerland has really been a pioneer on bilateral agreements with other countries to transfer climate mitigation outcomes. So different countries are going to be better placed to lead in different areas. And the goal is to be comprehensive. So eventually that map is going to be entirely filled in. So we're just here to report what's there. But I think, each country is leading in a different way, and eventually they'll all learn from each other and create that cohesive framework that kind of spans all 5 pillars that are needed for full CDR policy support.
And I can't see any questions coming in online, but if you do have any questions on Zoom, put them in the chat box. Are there any questions in the room about the policy tracker, or maybe what's been discovered in creating it? No, apparently everyone's feeling shy this morning. You're just giving me all the work. So we've seen that you've chosen certain countries already. Maybe out of which do you think is leading? Maybe Davina, let's go to you with this.
Sure. I mean, Denmark have been demonstrating incredible CDR ambition, but different countries are prioritizing different elements within the sort of suite of CDR technologies. So, for example, in the UK, they've got massive funding announced for the CDR methods that use geological storage with a 20 billion pledge for 20 years on CO2 transport and storage and CCUS. So CDR methods that would take advantage of that should see a big influx of private investment to match that.
Ida, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I think, again, I just wanted to highlight the kind of international outlook and the fact that one thing we're picking up from some of our partners and peers outside of Europe is, some of the elements of the European policy suite are quite innovative. So we look at things like the NZIA, the Net Zero Industry Act, that actually includes a CO2 storage target and talks about who's going to produce that storage capacity, namely the oil and gas producers. So that was really innovative. Also, I think people are looking at the CRCF. So just to say that the world is watching, and we're hoping that this helps kind of clarify what's available and what's coming.
When it comes to places, I mean, we've seen the US is really building up on carbon removals and funding for this type of thing. Do you think that Europe is on the back foot, or do you think that Europe is still in a position where it can lead in this area?
I think a lot of it comes down to the 2040 targets. I think Europe, it has historically been a climate leader, but there's the ceiling of ambition, we're not even close to it. So I would say it's always patchy, right? There's some areas in which Europe is leading. There's some areas in which other countries are leading. We've had some really interesting interactions with the CDR community in Kenya. So in East Africa, there's a massive low-cost geothermal energy potential. And there's also a CO2 storage potential. So, I think there's still really the leadership mantle is sort of anyone's to grab right now because CDR is still so nascent. But I think what we're hoping with things like the carbon removal certification framework is that Europe can do one of the things that the EU conventionally leads on is regulation, guidance on quality. And so, we still have to get there. But if we're successful and we can land the CRCF in a way that it actually ensures high quality carbon removal, that is potentially something to be emulated and followed by other peer countries and regions.
We have a question in the room. If you wait for the microphone to come to you.
Thanks. I try to shout. Did you find a relationship between the investment done, for example, in innovation and the policies in the different countries? So, for example, when you analyzed Germany or Denmark, did you see that there are more national investments in R&D programs or innovation or companies, and the policies reflect this kind of things, or didn't you find any kind of relationship?
Yeah, I would say that, I guess what would be interesting would be the link between investments in R&D and early stage innovation and an innovator ecosystem popping up. So I guess one example, and maybe Davina could build on this, in the UK, there was an initial infusion of about £100 million for demonstration of early stage CDR methods, things like biochar, enhanced mineralization. And indeed, a startup ecosystem has kind of breathed into existence. We also see kind of innovation hotspots in Switzerland, where there's an accelerator called Remove, which is just for CDR companies. I think you can trace that in large part to Switzerland's early investment in, a 6 million franc research program, but just in general, a desire through the research ecosystem in ETH Zurich to actually kind of focus on this area. So it really depends. We did do an analysis, which I don't have at the top of memory, on sort of Horizon Europe funding and how much of the Horizon Europe funding went to CDR. Very, very little. So I think the main message is, CDR is of course a complement to emission reduction. It will likely comprise between 5 and 20% of the progress towards climate neutrality in 2050. So it's a minority, but certainly there needs to be a lot more research and innovation support and comprehensive innovation policy at the member state level and the EU level if we have any chance of getting what we need in the 2030s and 2040s.
Davina, do you want to follow up on that?
Sure, I would just add, perhaps looking at the UK context, there was this 100 million fund for CDR innovation and R&D, but one of the more important policy focuses for those sorts of technologies to commercialize is what they call the business models for removal, which are essentially the deployment incentives that are needed for first of a kind technologies to be brought to market. So that's an area that the UK is focused on and is working on, and it's interesting to see where different countries across Europe are placing that emphasis. On the UK, it's very much commercializing the market, whereas at the EU-wide level, we're seeing the CRCF and more of a emphasis on certifying that a removal has really taken place.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, if there's one in the room. Yes, over here, please. The microphone's just behind you.
Does this work? Yes, it does. Thank you. Okay, Chris Davis now of CCS Europe. I'm looking at this Ecologic report, which came out 8 months ago, looking at just EU member states, where it says that basically member states describe CDR options but don't really have a policy. No member state has a dedicated strategy for CDRs, it says. No member states do not address CDRs in a comprehensive and strategic manner. Has that changed in the past 8 months?
I think I don't want to steal thunder from the panel that we'll discuss this later, and thinking about things like the NECPs and other kind of updates to the member state level planning. But I would largely say I wouldn't say that has changed. I don't think there are many examples of member states or non-member states in Europe who are thinking about CDR comprehensively. I mean, we have to be understanding here that carbon removal as an umbrella, uniting the worlds of forestry, soil, coastal vegetation management, and the more nascent high durability offshore carbon storage, that hasn't really been done before. So I don't think that civil services or politicians have really been tasked before with saying, well, we've got our emission reduction plan, what about carbon removals? So part of it is just getting to that point where these different governments are thinking in that way. But in general, no, I don't think we've seen the progress we'd like to, and we really need every member state to comment on, in their individual climate targets, how are they considering removals as distinct from emission reduction? To what and really this is critical in terms of risk, because over reliance on removals it would be a massive risk, as well as under reliance. So we need to see evidence that, and that's what we're hoping this tool can help instigate as well.
Davina, maybe you'd like to close our panel with a response to that, and also just say, what are your hopes for carbon removal in the next few years?
Absolutely. Well, one of our sort of dreams for this policy tracker is that we will start to be able to build a very comprehensive overview of the state of CDR policy in each country of Europe, and really looking at what's going well and what isn't, and what the gaps are that need to be filled. And I've forgotten the last part of your question.
Hopes for the future of the tracker or CDR.
Hopes for the future of the tracker. Well, I hope that you guys will all check it out and let us know what you think. This is version 1. We're going to be adding more and more content, and we're really interested to know what you would find useful, and what you think the CDR world needs in terms of policy demystifying.
Thank you. Well, that's an excellent note to finish on. Everyone go and look at the tracker, but not until the end of this session. Thank you so much, Eli and Davina. Now, to learn more about current and future European policy on carbon removals, I'd like to invite our next panel up onto the stage. They are Fabien Ramos, Policy Officer for Carbon Removal at the European Commission's Climate Department, DG CLIMA, Felix Schenuit, a research associate at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs and co-author of the State of CDR report, Sophie Scherger, European Programme Associate for Climate and Agriculture at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, and finally Andrea Klaric, Policy Director and Head of European Policy Strategy at Carbon Gap. Thank you all for joining us. Now, Fabien, let's start with you to kick off this discussion on the policy around carbon removals. We've seen a lot of work from the European Commission on this in the last few months and the last years. How do you see future CDR policy unfolding in the EU? That should be working.
Yeah, thank you very much. So how do I see future European policies on carbon removal unfolding? I think they've started to unfold. Let's go back to, for me, what is the starting point? The starting point is when we decided to be climate neutral by 2050 in the European Union. So at that time, the previous ambition was to reduce, I think, by 80%, I think, the emission reduction. And then in 2018, we come with this proposal, and it became a law, a European climate law, where it was set in law the fact that the European Commission has to be climate neutral by 2050, and to do that, we needed carbon, of course, to reduce as much as possible emission, and to neutralize, compensate the residual emissions with carbon removal. So it was acknowledged that we need carbon removal, and also the second part of this article of the climate law is saying that after 2050 we should aim for negative emissions. So it's really the starting point where we started to see, okay, we really need carbon removals. Where are we now, and what do we need to do later on? We came 2 years ago with a communication on sustainable carbon cycle, where we tried to give this vision, always the same. First, and most important priority, reducing emissions. Second, we need carbon in the future, and we need circularity. We should stop to use fossil carbon, and we need to reuse the carbon we have already in our economy to produce the material and the fuel we need, and we need carbon removal for reaching this objective of climate neutrality. And then we look at what we need on this carbon removal, and I think there is 3 key elements. First, we need trust, because it's not always obvious for everybody that we need carbon removal for 2050. Some people think that maybe if we do too much carbon removal, it's not good, because then people will stop to reduce their emissions. Some think that there can be some negative impact on carbon removal. So we have to really explain why we need carbon removal, and to ensure that the carbon removal that we want in our policies are the one of good quality. So this trust is very important, and this is why we came first with this proposal on the certification of carbon removal. Now, second, we need solutions to remove carbon. So carbon removal is about nature-based solutions. It's about technological-based solutions. On nature-based solutions, we have the LULUCF legislation. We have already a lot of things. On technological-based solutions, we have less. And we need more research, more innovation, and it has been already mentioned in the previous panel for that. So I think this is the second pillar that we need for the carbon removal policy in Europe, is to do a lot of effort on research and innovation. And the third one, and it's how to deploy that. What are the incentives to give, the finance, the funding on this, but also the regulations to do it correctly, to be sure that we do not decrease our effort on emission reductions to increase our effort on carbon removal. So there are really the 3 pillars for that. And then, we need deployment. We need to show the direction where we want to go. Eli mentioned the Net Zero Industry Act. That was very important, because in terms of infrastructure, I think it can unlock the situation where we are now, where people that have the possibility to capture CO2, they are a bit hesitant because they want to be sure that there is a storage, and the people with the storage facilities, they are looking for people to capture. So I think this will facilitate this. And I will stop here for this introduction. And
Thank you. Felix, let's come to you next. How do you view the role of carbon removals in current EU and member state policy, and what's your vision for the future of carbon removal policies, maybe thinking towards the 2040 target and reaching climate neutrality?
I have 5 minutes, right? So I could talk about it for a long time. Let me maybe start by saying I really appreciate this tracker as a tool for the policy debate. I think it is, or can be, really a valuable tool, because CDR is climbing up the agenda in Brussels, but also in member states. But we still really see that the, let's say, literacy of CDR policy is not very well. So if we talk to policymakers, but also NGOs, companies, there really is a lot to learn on CDR. I think the tool can be valuable here. And also I think the tool is a good step in coming from something that is kind of a discursive hype on CDR to more substance. Like, what is CDR relevant policy? We really need to improve the understanding of this in a lot of organizations, including the national administration. And that brings me to my second point also. Eli, I think, mentioned the the diverse regulatory cultures in member states. And I think we really need to talk about this if we talk about CDR in Brussels, because in our comparative work that we also did in the State of CDR report, we see that member states differ and that there are patterns of CDR policy making. I won't go into details of the different types that we identified, but I think it really is key to acknowledge that there are differences, that they will regulate CDR differently, and that we will not like define everything at EU level. Also, because we need to talk about policy a lot, but we also need to talk about politics, of course. There will be new alliances in climate policy because we now talk about CDR. And I think this really is a key issue. I'm happy to discuss more about that. If we talk about future CDR policy, I think the 2040 target really is the key debate. We heard about that already. I think the CRCF debate, all this is very important, but I think the really key file will be the 2040 target, because then we talk about, will we have separate target? Will we have a minimum reduction target or not? I think these issues are really key, and they really will cause struggles also in the European election that is upcoming. So yeah, happy to talk about that more, and maybe I finish here.
Excellent, thank you. Sophie, let's come to you next. Nature obviously plays a large role in carbon removal. What policy mechanisms and funding models do you want to see from Europe to help unlock the carbon absorbing potential of nature, but also while avoiding greenwashing and keeping the focus on reducing emissions?
I think what is really important when we talk about the land sink, we need to understand what it can do and what it cannot do. And I think it's very important to note that we cannot offset our way to 1.5 degrees because we don't have the carbon budget left for that. And we also don't have the land for that. We're talking about a carbon gap that we're having. We're also talking about a land gap that's existent. Right now, national pledges that exist amount to 1.2 billion hectares of land that need to be prioritized for CDR. So we need to see how we can marry a lot of the goals that we have and to reduce our reliance on removals as much as we can. So we're talking about residual emissions, we talk about 2040 targets. So I think we need to be very concrete what that actually means. I think 5 to 20% is still a very broad range when it comes to absolute removals that we need to achieve. And the goal must be to get as close to zero as possible. The IPCC makes it really clear, removals are no substitution for emissions reductions. And if we acknowledge that, we also need to acknowledge that we cannot do offsets anymore. And that's what the CRCF is actually setting us up to. So the question is, which way are we actually departing on? And which way do we want to go? And that brings me to the second part of what we can actually do. And when we talk about agriculture, we've had this conversation for a really long time, how to transition. What do we actually need to do? And our answer will be we need to have more public funds for public goods. And we need to move beyond the whole focus on carbon when we talk about the land sink. The land sink and ecosystem restoration is so much more valuable than us only talking about the contribution to mitigation. We're also talking about ecosystem resilience, resilience to climate shocks, and so on. And we're also talking about the social aspects of it. I think that's something that we cannot negate, that we cannot just shift away when we're talking about how do we want to implement finance. It needs to be human rights-based approach to finance. If we see what carbon markets have done to local communities in the Global South in the clean development mechanism, but also in Scotland. We're talking about land grabbing, we're talking about land speculation. And that's something that we need to take into account when we're talking about what kind of finance do we actually need. And the CAP has billions to spend on climate and agriculture and on environmental outcomes that needs to be spent, and we need to leverage that funding. We don't have that funding in the VCM right now. So I would say when we talk about land sink, we also need to look at it more broadly, more holistically. We need to see the intersections with other legislations, such as the soil health law, the nature restoration law, including the CAP and so on. We kind of look at it just only from one perspective. And if we're going down an offset way, we're creating much more problems than we're actually creating solutions. And I think that's where I'm going to stop now.
Thank you. Finally, Andrea, let's turn to you. We heard earlier about the new policy tracker. What are the lessons that can be learned from it so far?
Thank you, Kira. So I'd say there are kind of 3 key lessons that we can kind of draw from the policy tracker work. And kind of the first one refers to all these kind of policy developments. The second one is about, let's say, policy confusion, and the third one is about policy gaps. So starting with the kind of the policy developments, from the tracker we see there's basically carbon removal is kind of popping up across so the EU kind of policy arena, let's say. So there's different legislative, non-legislative initiatives that are kind of increasingly touching on different kind of bits of the CDR value chain and different methods of removing carbon from the atmosphere and storing it. So these kind of initiatives are increasingly getting connected, there's overlaps. So basically the idea behind the policy tracker was just to help connect these dots and identify these overlaps to make it really easier to understand what regulates what in this kind of big kind of umbrella of all these different methods of CDR, and also kind of these different modules of first removing, then transporting, removing carbon, transporting it, and storing it. So CRCF here, the certification framework, is kind of one good example where we see basically how it will complement a number of other initiatives. First, we can look at the Commission proposals, for example, on fighting greenwashing. CRCF can be one kind of a really good instrument to basically help establish what, when we think about carbon removals, legitimizing, let's say, net zero claims that some organizations and entities are doing. By that I mean, so basically, those kind of claims that refer to purchases of high quality permanent removals are certified by CRCF. There's a number of other initiatives where CRCF is basically going to be used as a building block. Then the second point is about, let's say, this confusion or lack of clarity. And here I'm specifically thinking about this kind of confusion, amalgamation of CDR and CCS. So for a number of initiatives on the policy tracker, we've seen that basically there's a little bit of a confusion between CDR and CCS. Very often we have regulatory frameworks, funding frameworks that are basically kind of merge the two, but are always designed with CCS in mind. And I think one example here is the Innovation Fund. So the Innovation Fund targets CCS as one of its key funding areas. Some CDR projects have gotten money. So some pretty big kind of substantive projects have gotten that money. Sorry, my leg is shaking a little bit. But in this space of CDR projects, they have to apply through the CCS, basically kind of the CCS bucket, and they have to basically apply based on the methods developed for CCS projects. So basically that makes it a lot harder for CDR projects to get the money because they have to adopt these different methodologies, and it also limits the CDR projects that can apply to basically DACs and BECs. So what we need is a call for projects that will be CDR focused, that will allow the CDR methods that are mature and ready to apply for this funding, basically to be judged and assessed based on their own merits. We see a similar issue with the Net Zero Industry Act that was mentioned earlier, where basically the Act excludes CDR, even though it's out of all the technological solutions that it does include, CDR is the only one that actually puts the net in the net zero. But again, so in this case, we also see kind of the overlap of the needs of CDR and the needs of CCS. So the CO2 injection capacity target that's set out in the NZIA will actually potentially benefit CDR as well by incentivizing the carbon basically the carbon storage and transport infrastructure in Europe. But again, we have to keep in mind that these are two very distinct climate solutions on our path to net zero, which means that when we think about managing this limited capacity, storage capacity in Europe, we need to think, both about CDR and CCS, and not just kind of, prioritizing CCS over CDR. And very briefly, the third point, I'm not going to repeat what was said, but that's about the policy gaps. So we see that there is not still a kind of holistic and strategic view of what CDR needs in Europe, basically there's no kind of a planned, a vision, a plan to scaling up effective, safe carbon removal solutions in Europe, and that is exactly what we need, and we're hoping for a vision for that coming from the Commission, maybe hopefully soon.
Excellent, thank you. Well, first I'd like to come to you, Fabien. We've heard some maybe criticisms about the complexities or not enough clarifications between CCS and CDR in certain acts, the Carbon Removal Certification Framework and the Net Zero Industry Act as well. What's your response to those?
Yeah. Thank you. I'm not sure that on this, well, yeah. I think it's indeed very important to be very clear about do we have real carbon removal or not when we are talking with the CCS. If carbon is coming from fossil fuel sources, I'm not sure we can talk about carbon removals. And in the context of certification of carbon removal, this is not what we are doing. And we are very clear that the carbon has to come directly from the atmosphere or indirectly, meaning through the use of biogenic carbon. What I would like to say and to react a little bit on what has been just said before is that this is true that, for instance, on the Net Zero Industry Act, in other contexts, we talk about CCS, we are not very specific on CDR, but I think we have also to be a bit pragmatic. Where is the urgency today? We really need to, as I previously said, to unlock this value chain of carbon capture and storage, and we need this storage capacity. And where can we capture the carbon? There is some industrial facilities where the concentration on CO2 is very high, and the cost, because of this very high concentration, the cost of capture of carbon is much lower than if you capture carbon directly from the atmosphere. And I think that if you want to start the pump, you have to start with application where the cost on capture is relatively low compared to other solutions. But that say, we do not close the door to capture carbon directly from the atmosphere or where it's less rich in CO2. We open it. It's just that we thought that we had to start with something, and this something was, in our view, the storage side. But in everything that we are doing, absolutely, you are right. We have to be very clear, and also to explain why sometimes we focus more on the storage side, sometimes we focus more on the capture, sometimes we have we look at all the elements of the value chain together, and we need to bring clarification. But in the future, this is very clear. We need 100 million of carbon removal. The new impact assessment on 2040 that on which we are working now will tell us, will update the number that we provided 5 years ago. There is an open public consultation ongoing, so you are very welcome to give your view on that. We were mentioning the importance to look at, should we look at only one net target or an emission reduction target and a carbon removal target, or maybe two carbon removal targets, one for nature-based solutions, one for technological-based solution. And this kind of questions, you can find it in the open public consultation, and this is what we are going to look at when we are going to work on this this year on the 2040 objectives that I think we all agree are very important.
Thank you. And a couple of you have mentioned harmonization and a holistic view. Obviously, countries, it depends on their geography, what type of carbon removals they can actually do. So are you hoping for some kind of EU holistic harmonized plan? Felix, you mentioned it. Maybe let's start with you. Do you think there could be some kind of strategy that would drive carbon removals?
I think we shouldn't aim for something that really regulates it all over Europe, because the countries are so different. We call this geographies of net zero ones, and I think it really is important because member states differ on what their residual emissions are. Also, they differ on what the socio-political preferences on different CDR methods are. And I think we really should acknowledge that. If you think about carbon farming, for example, and the different opinions on that in the governments, what you can see in the CRCF file. So I think there shouldn't be something that is very holistic for all CDR policy in the European Union. What we should think about strategically is really how to integrate CDR into the existing policy instrument and the governance architecture for the period between 2030 and 2040, because that is what we're going to talk about after the 2040 target is out. And then we have these discussions about whether we want to integrate CDR in the ETS and what are ways to do that. We will talk about the other policy instruments that are there and how CDR can be included in that. And I really think that we should focus on this medium or maybe even long-term decisions on how to integrate CDR strategically and not like jump on every occasion where we could maybe talk about CDR, but really think the long-term game and build the capacities also in the administration to ask questions to the people, like, how do you want to do it in 10 years? What role should CDR play in the long term? I think these are the questions that we should ask.
Sophie, what's your view on that from the more land use side?
I think we need to be very realistic about what can actually be done, and also acknowledge that there are a lot of policies in the land sector that already exist that deal with carbon farming in a broader frame. I mean, if we talk about the nature restoration law, if you do restore nature, if you shift public subsidies in the CAP to agroecological systems, we have to fundamentally transform the way we do agriculture. We do use our land, and that's not only focused on carbon. So I think really shifting away from that and acknowledging the different realities. I mean, we can talk about permanence, for example. We always come back to the issue of permanence when we talk about land use. And we have very different realities if we talk about Sweden or if we talk about Spain in terms of geographies, in terms of what kind of ecosystems are there? How can we actually make them more climate resilient? I think that must be the focus much more than saying we need to certify some kind of credits that we need to have to finance them. Because if we look at the reality of the climate crisis, we're looking at wildfires every year. We're looking at, let's take California as an example. Right? In the compliance market, last decade's wildfires have burned down the buffer pool that was supposed to uphold the integrity of the scheme for the next 100 years. So if we're talking about the land sector, we can set principles, what kind of activities we want to support in terms of biodiversity, in terms of having flourishing local communities. But it needs to be adapted to the local context and accept the reality of the climate crisis.
Fabien, I'd like to pick up on that point with you. So we have heard, particularly land-based removals can be very vulnerable to things like wildfires. What's the European Commission doing in terms of ensuring that that won't affect the integrity of carbon removals?
No. To be climate neutral, we need... Sorry?
More firefighters.
More firefighters is one of the suggestions in the room.
Yeah, we need more firefighters. No, but we need carbon removal coming from a portfolio of solutions, and land-based carbon removal are very important. The point is, it has been mentioned, it's very difficult. The ecosystem are dynamic. It's very difficult to talk about permanence. When we talk about land-based carbon removal, and we have to account for that. Again, we are working on the certification of carbon removal. We want to be very transparent on what type of carbon removal we have in the hands. And once we have this information, when we look at, I think you have in mind what the current ongoing initiative on green claims. So if someone is doing a claim on carbon removals, it has to be very clear if this claim is on non-permanent carbon removals. We have to know it, because you cannot do the same kind of claims when it's non-permanent and when it's a permanent carbon removal. But we need all that, and yes, we need to take into account the evolution of our climate and more risks for our natural things. And this is also one area where the European Commission is trying to improve the situation to make our land more resilient to climate change. So it's important to work at all these levels. First, when we promote carbon farming solutions, we have to think what kind of solutions do we want to promote. I don't think that having monoculture forest everywhere in Europe is a good solution. So we have to be very careful on that and to be sure that our ecosystems are resilient, are biodiverse, and this is the famous sustainability criteria that we want. That is also very important to the certification. And again, we need to have some the design of the use of the certification and the design of the certification and how we are going to use this certificate is a key element. On the design of certification, we have to look at the liability issue for land-based carbon removals, but also for permanent carbon removals. When you have a leakage somewhere, someone has to be liable for this leakage. And for carbon removals, for carbon farming, we have to be realistic. It has a cost for farmer to go for carbon farming, and the farmer needs certainties when he wants to implement his new practices for carbon, and we have to find a way to have a system that is functioning correctly, where there is no greenwashing, where everybody is going in the right direction, but also that's something that is cost efficient and affordable for the people that want to put in place these practices.
Does anyone on the panel want to respond to that?
I would just want to question, when we talk about the right use of resources, of public resources, if it's the right path to go down, setting up a voluntary scheme that might or might not deliver the removals and paying a lot of certifiers, project developers, where we could use public money much more directly to support the practices that we already know work, and that in policies that already do exist, without putting this all of this liability we talked about. And we see it already playing out in the US when we look at the voluntary carbon markets, that farmers are really hesitant because it's a lot they take on. And the question is also, are we actually challenging the power in the agriculture system, in the lands, in our land sector? I think when we carbon farming is much more than, or changing agricultural practices is much more than only the carbon perspective. It's about how do we change the power relations between land managers and the corporations. Are we actually doing that when we're setting up a crediting system? I don't think so. So I think we cannot see this in isolation. Farmers are price takers in voluntary carbon markets as they are in commodity markets. So we need to question these fundamental economics and not setting up a system that makes them even more dependent on those things and doesn't really sustainably change how we do things.
Please respond to that.
Yeah, so very briefly on this, very briefly. I will take the time that you need, but I want to we are able to address all different type of topics. But on this, first, a clarification. We are not coming with an EU voluntary carbon market scheme. It's not what we are putting in place. What we are putting in place, and it has been said very well before, is a tool, a building block to identify the right type of carbon removals and to give all the information necessary when you want to build on that. So if voluntary carbon markets want to use this tool for themselves to develop a new way of farming for farmers, to complement the revenues of farmers that are doing action to put in place practices that are good for the climate, then we are happy to provide this tool to them, to have a transparent tool that has been designed with a consensus of the expert among the expert group, of the co-legislature, European Parliament, and member state. So this is more a tool that we provide that could help the development of new business model for farming. And then how this tool is going to be used only on carbon market, I'm not sure, that on voluntary carbon market, I'm not sure that this is our intention, and I don't think this is our intention, but if we want in the future to use the cap to, I don't know, regional funds, for instance, if we want a tool for result-based approach in some type of fundings, maybe it could be also useful. So I see it more as a tool that as a market we are creating ourselves.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the room about this? Yes, we have a question down here. The microphone is on its way to you in the front row.
Hi, Vernon Stoofs, Carbon Market Watch. I have a question that links to this and also to the title of the panel about the future of EU CDR policy. Removals, in essence, is a public good. You do something that has positive externalities for others across the globe. You've talked a lot about climate neutrality. Sophie was hinting at voluntary carbon markets, climate neutrality claims, net zero claims. While climate neutrality is actually something that only makes sense at a societal or even a global level. So what does that mean if we want to have removals as a public good and climate neutrality at a societal level? what does that mean for the future of CDR policy?
Fabien, maybe let's start with you and the European Commission's thoughts on this.
The work, again, I will go back to this work that we are doing for 2040. So to look at the pathway toward climate neutrality in 2050, we need to look at all the sectors of the economy and understand what should be the contribution and the different scenarios. And because it's very difficult to give only one pathway toward 2050, it depends also about different elements that will unfold towards this 2050, the speed of the readiness of technological solutions, the state of our forest. Let's not forget that the LULUCF sink in Europe is currently decreasing, and we really need to revert this decrease and to have more absorption from our biodiverse ecosystem in Europe. So this work on 2040 will be very important to give us a picture of what we need to do in different sectors and what will be the role of carbon removals. And not all the sectors might be climate neutral. Maybe some of the sectors will still emit a little bit, let's decrease it as much as possible. Some other sector will be carbon negative. And we need to, all together, to reach in 2050 the climate neutrality, and after that, aim at net negative emissions after this. So I cannot say that, so the CDR policies, we need to look at what is the potential of different sectors for CDR. We need to look at consistencies with other policies. Does it make sense to store all the carbon that we are capturing? Or is it better to recycle the carbon to produce some material and some fuel and to stop to use the fossil carbon? We are talking a lot about CCS when it's about technological solutions, but maybe to 2040, to 2050, we will have other type of carbon removal, enhanced rock weathering, ocean alkalinization, but on all that, I think we need much more certainty that we have today, effect on pollutions, resources also. It's very important. We are talking about land resources, but it's not only about land resources. When you look at CDR technologies, you realize that you need some raw materials, you need a lot of energy, and we have to have a good overview of all the implications of deploying carbon removal solutions in this regard. So once again, the work we are starting on 2040 is important, and we are also working on a communications towards the end of the year on industrial carbon management that will put a focus on solutions capturing, transporting, and storing carbon with all the infrastructure aspect. And this is another element on which we have to work together this year.
Andrea, I'd like to come to you also on this question. In putting together the policy tracker, you've looked at different country approaches. Do you feel like some countries are leading on maybe a more public commodity type approach to carbon removals?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, maybe just to first to say that basically if we are to reach our targets by 2050, 5 to 20% of that will have to probably be carbon removal. So what we need is basically a very sober look at what that will look like, starting from, let's say, research and development to study not just, new methods, but also, what are the trade-offs, what are the risks, how we mitigate them, to thinking about deployments, accelerating permanent removals because of all these challenges with land-based removals as well. So it's really looking at the, how we do this because we know we will have to do it. So instead of kind of, it is really kind of studying both the kind of the pros and the cons and thinking about the energy resources needed and all the other resources needed, how we basically address that and how we tackle that. Not all of the CDR methods maybe will be there and will be needed or are the right ones, but we need to start thinking about it and doing that kind of that study and research and those decisions because the time it's not a lot of time. So I think that's quite important that we start thinking about that now. And then kind of thinking of what the other countries or what the countries in Europe are doing. There's obviously very different approaches that depend on basically the geographies, the resources, socioeconomic preferences, and that's okay. And it's okay if certain countries kind of focus on different areas, and some countries are kind of already thinking about it. If we think about Denmark, for example, and their kind of work on enabling this storage capacity in the North Sea, that is seen very much as a priority for the nation. Where I think that's when we think about kind of having a plan and a vision, a strategy at the EU level, at the European level, there have to be kind of inherent flexibilities to allow for different countries to kind of go faster on certain things and others kind of to choose other things. And I think that's quite important to put in that European vision. And where I see really kind of the opportunity for the EU to act is, for example, CRCF, type of kind of regulatory framework that will enable a Europe-wide, whether it's going to be a voluntary market or something else, but kind of having that underpinning regulatory structure that provides trust in carbon removals in Europe. Or, for example, thinking about transborder infrastructure, so transport and storage capabilities. It's really at the EU level that we want to address these questions and basically coordinate the work of member states. Also, again, based on their kind of geographical capabilities and kind of all the other economic and social questions as well.
Felix, I'd like to come to you. You mentioned the ETS earlier. What role do you see carbon markets playing compared to public funding?
Yeah, very good question. Maybe just one other thing I wanted to mention in reaction to what we heard earlier. Because we talked about trust a lot, I think all of us talked about trust also. If we talk about trust in removals, we need to first make sure that we have that we actually prioritize emission reduction in the 2040 target. I think this really is key, that we operationalize that. And we see efforts of blurring this, and I think it is really important that if we care about trust, that we get emission reduction first. And then in a second step, and not after that, but at the same time, manage to set up an incentive structure for removals that is maybe at the end also result-based, so that we can actually pay per ton removed. So I think these are the two things that are important when it comes to trust. And carbon markets, and especially the ETS, I'm not an expert on voluntary carbon markets, but I think the ETS debate, and I mentioned it already briefly, I was involved in a paper where we discussed a possible idea of a European carbon central bank, a kind of institution that we need to set up to integrate CDR in the ETS if we want to do it. And I would say, well, this debate is really looming because the last certificate will be sold in 2039, and then it's before the 2040 target. And this debate really is one that we should have. I know it's controversial and I know it's difficult, but I think it really is key that we then think about institutions that we can set up to facilitate this.
And Sophie, what do you think of public funding? Do you think it really should be the prioritization, or do you think it can work alongside voluntary markets?
I think key is really moving away from the idea we can compensate emissions, from the whole compensation logic that carbon markets operate on. I mean, there are different ways of, you can think about private funding. I mean, for us, I think the focus is still on public funding for public goods. And there can be many different ways that this can be implemented in the different member states and also internationally. I think one thing that we need to be very mindful of is that what happens in the EU is very, very much a global trendsetter, and it very much influences also international conversations, including at the UNFCCC in Article 6. So it's really important that we get this right, and we're not laying groundwork that's going to lead us into a whole bunch of mitigation deterrents.
Thank you. Are there any other questions in the room? We have a hand raised over here.
Hi, thank you very much for a great panel. I'm Hanna Oinen from Carboculture. We're a biochar carbon removal company. We heard really great things, both from the Commission, Fabien, Ramos, saying that, of course, we need this portfolio approach, but also to look at the removals that are there and that have a high concentration of carbon and can remove this carbon at a affordable rate. And we heard all these technologies mentioned, that we need, ocean mineralization, dock specs, and it was. I wanted to add biochar carbon removal into the discussion because there was also a comment from Andrea that we appreciated, which was saying that, you know, how can we support the first of a kind funding for these other technologies that do not are not limited to the CCS directive, for instance, and this is exactly kind of the question that we would have. How do you see the bringing together of this comment of, okay, we need to get the, you know, the pump rolling, like you said. We need to use the tools that are existing and are there, and that we can also improve. And biochar carbon removal is there. It's CDR FYI, we provided 87% of all the carbon removal last year. And of course biomass, waste biomass for Sophie, has a high carbon content, you know, over 50%. So the carbon concentration is there as well. And so how do you see this statement of, okay, we need to, you know, start the pump rolling where it's already rolling a little bit, and then also still having these requirements of having this solid carbon from waste biomass and within biochar, trying to kind of put that within this CCS directive or CCS principles where it's just not feasible. So how do you see these two viewpoints coming together with the example of biochar carbon removal? Thank you.
Biochar is indeed something very important to address, and because you said it, when we look at the very few carbon removal units that have been bought these last years, biochar makes maybe 80 or 90% of it. I don't have the right number. Biochar is something a bit specific because in the certification of carbon removal that we have different categories. We have the permanent carbon removals, we have carbon removals in products, and we have carbon removals for carbon farming. And biochar, in a way, you can put it in these three categories because for carbon farming, some people are using biochar for a long time to improve the structure of the soil, and we call that an amendment, a soil amendment. Then we have we have biochar that can replace concrete in construction material, and construction is another type of carbon removal that we need to look at. And we can also, if we put biochar in the good condition in the soil or in the subsoil, we can. Scientific studies say that it can stay there for a very long time. And this is exactly what we want to look at in the context of the certification of carbon removal. We need this certainty because in the past there were some controversy, some discussion about the real effect of biochar. And we come back to this trust element that is very important. And I agree that the potential of biochar is big. If you look at IPCC report that assess the potential of biochar, in this report you will find some big numbers. So it's absolutely a carbon removal solution we need to look at. I think the certification of carbon removal is the right place to start because you will we can propose methodology that will reassure everybody that everything is okay with this type of solutions. But then after biochar, I see it a little bit like bioenergy and CCS because biochar, if we prove that storage is permanent, you can have biochar as a co-product when you do gasification of waste biomass, for instance. So you produce biogas and you have your biochar or biofuels, and you have your biochar. So I fully agree that this is something we need to look at.
And following on from that, we have a question coming in from online. For you, the Commission always gets lots of questions on these panels. If the Commission is treating CCS only as a starting point in CDR policy, why was permanence in the CRCF only defined in geological formations and not based on time frame of storage?
When I say that we started from storage, I'm not sure I exactly say that we have to start from the CCS aspect, from the storage aspect. I was more reacting to a comment that were done on the Net Zero Industrial Act, where I think it's very important to unlock this value chain of carbon capture and storage. But in the context of the CRCF, we are looking at all the elements of the value chain together. And we talk about geological storage of carbon, but it's not only a CCS in the sense of storing carbon in saline aquifer or depleted oil and gas field. It's also, I think, when you look at the guidance document of the CCS directive, and there is also carbon mineralization in the basalt. So The question is, if we want to be a little bit technical, for carbon mineralization, should we look only at basalt or other type of rocks? Because it's also important. And we were talking briefly about enhanced rock weathering. And one of the questions is, when you do enhanced rock weathering, there is the question of the pollution with heavy metals, and with some type of rocks, you have less pollution with other type of rocks. And this is why we need better understanding of all these processes before being able to come with a methodology for the certification. So we are open in the context of the certification of carbon removal. It's really an open framework. We are going to get more and more maturity of different type of carbon removal solutions, and we should be able to integrate all these carbon removal solutions when science has said, yes, this is safe, this is the right way to do it, we can develop a methodology for that. Now we want to start with BECS and DACs because this is where we have better knowledge. But in the coming years, I'm convinced that there is a question of biochar also that we are looking at very closely. And then progressively, one after the other, we want to include carbon removal, other type of carbon removal solutions, and also, of course, without forgetting all the solutions based on forest and on soil carbon, etc.
And we have another question coming in online, picking up the US angle of this. Obviously, Europe is not the only area which is looking into carbon removals. Maybe Sophie, let's start with you. How does the Europe compare to the US when we look at the funding and the push in the US for carbon removals compared to things like the Net Zero Industry Act in the EU?
I mean, I'm going to focus on the land activities when it comes to that. So I'm going to let maybe others answer when it comes to the technological removals and CCS and so on. But we've been talking about land-based removals in the US for quite a long time. We have different projects, such as in the California carbon market, where we have agriculture and so on in there. And there's been in the Growing Climate Solutions Act, there was a proposal for a carbon offset approach to land-based removals, which is basically which has faced a lot of resistance, especially from the environmental justice community. And what it actually comes down to right now is just a website where you can register your project, because there was no political agreement actually on how that could be. And if we look back in US history, they've tried to set up a carbon market for land-based activities in 2009, I think, when a lot of farmers invested in soil carbon projects and no-till projects. What actually happened with the Chicago Stock Exchange in 2009 was that it collapsed. So there's a lot of hesitancy, I would say. And there are also good approaches. When we look at the Farm Bill and a lot of conservation agriculture spending into activity-based finance, that is severely underfunded, and there's a lot of demand for it, and where you can achieve a lot.
Thank you. Fabien, maybe let's come to you. Do you see the US as a competitor or as someone who you can collaborate with as the European Commission on carbon removals?
Removing carbon from the atmosphere is a global challenge. It's not the EU alone, of course. We have to collaborate. We need international collaboration. It's happening. There was a G7 statement recently on carbon management that is important. There is also, of course, other work in the context of the UNHCR policy. There is this CDR Mission Innovation Launchpad, where the Commission is also joining. So there are many different and more international collaboration on CDR, and we are all at the same level. We don't have yet the numbers that we need to scale up carbon removal for the Paris, to reach the objective of the Paris Agreement, and we need to collaborate on that. The EU has its own specificities, so maybe it's a good place for a certain type of carbon removal, but maybe it's more efficient to do other type of carbon removal in other parts of the world. So we have to do what we can do within the EU. We have to do it, and we have to put in place the policies, and then we have to look at how we can better support also the development of other carbon removal solutions outside the EU through different type of collaborations. So definitely it's an area where we absolutely need collaboration. A little bit of competition is also good because it gives a stimuli to develop faster carbon removal, but we really need collaboration on that.
Thank you. And we're beginning to run out of time. Felix, I know you want to come on this, so maybe if you could roll your final takeaway from this into your response to this. I know it's a big ask.
I actually wanted to say the same. I think the G7 statement is interesting, also because of it frames it again as carbon management. So this term is going anywhere. We really have to deal and understand the differences of the different aspects of carbon management. Then the US also launched their carbon management diplomacy initiative, or so they really want to talk about carbon management at COPs as well. So I think this is relevant development as well. And they have much more than the EU an idea of how to do result-based incentive structures for removals, and that is, I think, relevant there. Yeah, closing remarks, I think I'm repeating myself, but I really think the 2040 target is key. We need to think about the design, whether we have separate targets or not, what are pitfalls of the specific designs, and also think about the trickle-down effects of this target for member states. So how will member states then deal with a specific target design? I think that are the key questions. And then think about the policy instrument, the ETS and other elements of the governance structure, how they could include CDR or not. So I think this really should be an open debate.
Thank you. Sophie, let's come to you next. What stood out for you today in today's discussion?
I mean, I guess I'm also repeating myself, but yeah, I think carbon removals are here to stay. So we need to talk about how we best implement them. And when it comes to carbon farming, we need to look at the social, the environmental, and the whole range of aspects that play into that. And we need to actually tackle the power relations in our food system if we really want to change the way we do agriculture. So that's it.
Thank you. Andrea, what's your takeaway from today?
Thank you. So I would just also tie on the discussions with about the US and kind of seeing really an opportunity in many different CDR methods that they're trying to incentivize. And I do agree that I think the relationship between the EU and the US should be more of a cooperation than necessarily only competition. But in order for us to have this cooperation, I think the EU has to be able to pull its own weight. And therefore, we do need a real kind of strategic, holistic approach to CDR. We do kind of need to think about incentivizing, encouraging a CDR ecosystem here in Europe as well, and not necessarily, potentially risking losing our talent to the US. And so for that, again, I will also be repeating myself to say, we do need tailored policy frameworks. We need the right economic incentives for the whole kind of portfolio of CDR methods and the entire value chains. So from kind of boosting dedicated research and innovation funds to long-term tailored deployment incentives to kind of the right clear policy frameworks, rules, and standards that we need to put in place. Then thinking really long-term about what are those kind of enduring policy regimes where we kind of integrate CDR policies and CDR into kind of long-term hard policy. Again, this is kind of the next step, looking towards the future, but I do think we need to kind of start thinking about these challenges. Thank you.
And Fabien, finally, what's your take on this?
Yeah. I would like to come back to what has been presented today, the carbon tracker, the CDR tracker from Carbon Gap. I think it's going to be a tool very useful also, and what I will hope is that in this tracker, we could find soon also what is inside the NECPs, because it was mentioned earlier this morning. I think we talked a lot about what we need at the EU level, what should be the international cooperation, but who is going to do the real work is the member state when they will design their policies for 2030 and after. And there is clear instruction in our governance regulation on what should be in the national climate and energy plan of different member states on land-based solution. So carbon removal from land-based solution, but also on storage and more technological solutions. So it will be very helpful if when available, when all these plans from member states are available, that this kind of information could also be tracked by your tool. That I think will be very useful and will give a fantastic overview of what is happening in different member states.
Thank you. Well, clearly a very big task ahead for Carbon Gap and for everyone. So we've heard today there's a lot of progress that has been made, but there's also a lot left to do. The 2040 climate target will be key in this, and as said, the public consultation is still open, so you can have your say on it. The right economic incentives are needed. We've heard questions on voluntary markets, also what public funding is available, and also key things about certification. And again, we'll all be watching as the carbon removal certification framework is debated. So thank you to all of our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. And thank you for joining us today. Thank you. Now, if I could invite you to go back to your seats, we have one final speaker to close our event today. I'd like to invite Glenn Morley, the CEO of Carbon Gap, to give today's closing remarks. You have the floor.
Ah, the microphone works. Good. Thank you, everybody who turned up today here physically, and thank you for everybody who has joined online, and thank you to the people who will watch later. So enjoy. I think it was interesting. It's quite a lively panel debate, and thank you, Fabien, for giving us version 2 and version 3. Policy Tracker is the first of a number of assets that we want to create to facilitate development of effective policy in Europe. We prefer to work collaboratively, so we work with partners, we want to build coalitions. And Policy Tracker, if you like, is a first step of closing one of the gaps that we identified when we created Carbon Gap, which is the knowledge gap, putting information about the policies that exist, that are being developed in the hands of people who can come together to help policymakers do their job more effectively. So that's what this is about. I want to thank a number of people. I want to thank the team that made this possible. We've done quite a lot in 9 months since we set up in Brussels, so it's no mean feat to turn these things out. The first version is the first taste. We plan to do much more. Thank you to Breakthrough Energy for providing a little bit of project help with funding support for this. And thank you for a number of partners who played a very important role. I don't want to miss any, so I'm going to refer to my list. Net Zero Tracker, thank you to you. Carbon Future, Concito in Denmark, and Zentrum Liberal Modern in Germany. We can't do this on our own. We do this with other people, and we will continue to build that coalition of other policy experts who can bring that information together and make that available to everybody who needs that. We have a number of other things on our agenda, things we want to create. I'm not going to spoil them today, but keep watching the Carbon Gap space. There are a number of things coming up which fit very nicely with some of the things discussed by the panel today. And I just want to draw on a couple of things that came up today, which I think really emphasize the challenge we face. Carbon Gap was created to if you like, act as a vehicle to take us to a stable climate. We do that through assisting the development of effective policy for carbon removal. And it's interesting listening to people talk today, listening to the complexity of that policy as it emerges, the interconnections, the fact that no two countries or states are the same, the need to create a possibility for all the different carbon removal solutions to come together and play their part in a portfolio. This is quite a complex picture. We need to help people understand that, and that's the role of Carbon Gap. Thank you for your attendance today. Thank you.